gatekeeper response to the real casino, and then how that affected WiseAcre and so on and so forth. Talking about critics and film programmers, festival programmers, so on. So, right off the bat, it was a success story, which might have been a problem. It started its life on the Independent Film Channel as part of the show Split Screen. The Minneapolis Star Tribune wrote kind of a positive thing on it when it showed on IFC and some other things. One of the first things that I put it up on during the kind of the .com thing when streaming was first a thing, the very first thing written about it said, absolutely brilliant, rips away the sheer veneer of the Mafia film. Couldn't get any better than that. But a lot of quote-unquote critics, this guy Mike White of Cashiers to Cinemark, this magazine, Mike Everleth, who had this kind of underground film site, which it might not have been appropriate for, but he became someone who wrote, like about the New York Underground Film Festival, Chicago Underground. He became kind of a part of the IMDb news desk, so his reviews would show up as a link. Had a friend who was a, kind of wannabe DP, Taylor Wigdon, who shot a couple things, never really was successful, but there was all this vibe of these guys so they kind of took these vague, pissy, kind of bullshitty shots at the film that never really made sense. Sometimes whining about it, I was pulling clips from GoodFellas, which is a mob companion piece to Casino, and certain things were being said that more explicitly related to GoodFellas in a way, or Thief, which they shared the Chicago connection, and so on and so forth. I'll get into more detail later. Because it had that success on IFC, right off the bat, that seemed to be a problem. We need to take this down a notch, And so that kind of affected festivals. It was close to Sundance, some other things. It got into about 20 plus festivals and did well. I go into a lot of detail on Alex Ferrari's show, Indie Film Hustle. I cut many different versions for different distributors, so it always did well. But it could have done better, It had not faced a little bit of this resistance, a few extra film festivals. It could have helped make the difference to get WiseAcre off the ground. I'll go into more detail on that later. But what all the kind of pissy, whiny kind of critique boiled down to was kind of a wannabe vibe. That's what they all seem to share and have in common. And that's not to say you couldn't have an honest, view of the film. Alan Richards had a very, kind of objective, these are the strengths. He wrote for Be Independent, this site that he ran. These are the strengths, these are the weaknesses, this would have could have been better. This guy, Chris Perry, for a site called E-Film Critic, it's compelling stuff. Maybe if you'd done this a little differently, of course, that makes sense. But it wasn't this kind of like pissy little, let's find a way to shit on the film kind of thing. The film critics, the better reviews consistently, a couple, bigger, better festivals added, was where WiseAcre would have benefited tremendously, which is based on the making of the real Casino. Think a much darker, sharper edged Get Shorty, Midnight Run. There's the comedic element, probably most akin, actually to Scorsese's King of Comedy. Rupert Pupkin doesn't really care about being a comedian. It's about fame. The main character in WiseAcre, similarly, Joe DeFranco is this wannabe filmmaker who's making this documentary about these mafia guys, but he doesn't care about that. He just cares about fame. If with the Everleft thing, as I mentioned, he had a website that was picked up by IMDb. A lot of bigger festivals, they go off that hype because it's on your quote-unquote news link on IMDb and so forth, and that would have made a big difference in agents and managers and a few better festivals. I was close to Sundance in 2000. I was actually very close to Slam Dance, the longer version, in 1998. Like Dallas Video Festival. Yeah, I cut a shorter version for that Universal's Hypnotic, Doug Lyman's company, picked up the shorter version, but maybe a couple more bigger festivals, South by, that was in the cards. Getting that, now all of a sudden you have a better manager, a better agent, you have a better chance of getting a WiseAcre off the ground, which I think could have revived a dead genre in the whole Mafia thing in kind of a different way, something that had some real subtext about the moment that we're living in. I still think it could revive a dead genre. I still think it could be, a very interesting film on many levels. It do well. It as I said, got on that TF1 DVD in France. Worked with a manager on that script, Peter Green, who hip-pocketed me for a while. We worked on the script a little bit, for a much more comedic, Mickey Blue Eyes kind of thing. Peter and John Gersha actually run a series of festivals in Los Angeles, a Culver City Film Festival, Marina del Rey, several others. I've screened subsequently. He was helpful, but it was taking some of the edge off. Wasn't exactly what I was envisioning. But to give you an example, that those smaller bumps make a difference and could have helped get that film made. I'm convinced of it. One of those criticisms of the film is, why this cut, here in GoodFellas, random clips from GoodFellas, or Thief. What does that have to do with it? And in the case of GoodFellas, well, Casino was kind of, sometimes dismissed if people didn't like it as much. Oh, it's just Goodfellas in Vegas, right? They're companion pieces, right? For Scorsese, it was kind of part of a trilogy of sorts, starting with Mean Streets. They were really small time in Little Italy, then moved out into the boroughs, out in Queens and Brooklyn, in Goodfellas, and then it became very corporate with the Chicago outfit guys in Vegas. Mike Gardino's describing a situation where these two brothers, his cousins, got into a beef, one shot the other. That was a more direct comparison in Goodfellas, whereas, the Tony Spilotro character, Nicky Santoro, he stabs a guy with a pen, but it's not a real beef per se, in the sense that the enforcer, he's going to make sure no one messes with, quote unquote, the golden Jew, Frank Lefty Rosenthal. It's not an organic beef like I've seen these things in real life. Someone's, breaking a glass or, a pen, or getting shot, like Mike Gardino describes. It was a more apt comparison.
Got into a beef one night in my uncle's bar, which was their father.
I pulled a clip from The Age of Innocence.
The smaller of the two went out to his car, got a gun, come back and shot his brother.
Thief, he's talking about the judge was in on it. This requires, there's a little bit more inside baseball, but Mike is talking about kind of being leaned on.
Police would come in there, I had undercover cops come in my place, and they were saying that they took me to, they locked me up, they took me to 11th State, and then when I went to court the next day, I went there, my dad went with me, and it was all like, judge was in on it and everything. I don't remember his name, I wish I did. But
Grand and Ogden, that general area, and know some of the same people connected to Milwaukee, Phil Aldericio, so on and so forth. So that was a more direct comparison that I'm going for there. And it's not as obvious, needs a little more explanation, but that's, where that was.